There are places on Earth that are older than memory itself, where stone seems to hold its breath. The canyons of Utah are such a place. These are not just cracks in the landscape. They are stone jaws waiting millions of years for their prey. They do not hunt. They simply wait. Ancient Indian tribes believed that these rocks had a spirit, indifferent, silent, and unforgiving of arrogance. For years they swallowed up those who dared to challenge them alone, leaving nothing but mysterious stories that rangers pass on to each other around the night campfire. In 2003, Aaron Ralston, a brilliant engineer and elite athlete, entered the heart of this stone labyrinth. Armed only with his skill and an almost arrogant belief in his own self-sufficiency. His goal was not a record, but a form of spiritual purity that he believed could only be found in absolute solitude. But the story that shook the world hides something more than just an act of survival. It hides the truth about what 5 days of absolute silence did to his soul, and why the man who came out of the canyon was not the same man who went in. At 27, Aaron Ralston was a living embodiment of success, commonly referred to as the American dream. He graduated with honors from the prestigious Carnegie Mellon University with a degree in mechanical engineering. Immediately after graduation, he was hired by Intel. In this technology giant, he spent 5 years designing microchips and earning a salary approaching 6 figures. But outside the office walls, in the sterile world of corporate routine, he felt like a cog in a vast machine. His real life began where the asphalt ended. In 2002, he did something that his conservative parents called reckless. Aaron quit Intel, left stability behind, and moved to Aspen, Colorado. He took a simple job as a salesman at Ute Mountaineer, an outdoor gear store, earning just enough to pay for modest housing and food. He devoted all his other time to his one true passion, the mountains. His main obsession became the 14ers Project, the ambitious goal of climbing all 59 of Colorado's highest peaks alone in winter, something no one had ever done before. He was a respected and controversial figure in the mountaineering community. His endurance and technical skill were unquestionable, but his penchant for risk-taking and disregard for safety rules caused concern for many. Just a year before the events in Utah, in February 2002, nature had already sent him a warning. During their descent from Resolution Peak, he and his 2 partners, Mark Beverly and Chadwick Spencer, triggered an avalanche. The 330-foot wide mass of snow dragged them down the slope, burying one of them up to his head. All 3 miraculously survived, suffering only bruises and mild hypothermia. But after the rescue, his friends stopped talking to him. Their silent reproach was straightforward, but Aaron took their alienation not as a warning, but as confirmation of his own exceptionalism. He attributed their reaction to excessive caution, to an inability to understand the pure, primal call of the mountains that he heard. Their departure only reinforced his belief that his path was that of a loner, and the avalanche incident was further proof that he was invulnerable. The air in Utah on the morning of 26 April 2003 was crystal clear and calm. Aaron Ralston pedaled his mountain bike, and the sound of tires rustling through the reddish dust was the only thing breaking the silence. Fish played in his headphones, the soundtrack to his personal freedom. He left behind 80-hour work weeks, his parents' worries, and civilization itself. Here, under the endless sky, alone with the ancient rocks, he was not just an engineer or an equipment salesman. He was an explorer, the master of his own universe, and a slight smile never left his face. By noon, he left his bike at the foot of the rocks and continued on foot. Soon, he noticed 2 figures who turned out to be tourists from his own city. They exchanged a few words, and he even jokingly showed them a simple climbing technique on a low boulder. For a moment, there was a feeling of camaraderie, a fleeting connection with another human being. But Aaron politely said goodbye and moved on. Loneliness was his conscious choice, his religion. An hour later, A narrow, almost invisible crack in the rock opened up in front of him, from which a cool breeze blew. It was the entrance to Blue John Canyon. He took one last look at the endless blue sky and, without hesitation, stepped into the shade. The canyon grew narrower. The sunlight remained somewhere high above, turning into a thin, barely noticeable strip of blue. Aaron moved with the measured grace of an athlete. Every step, every movement was a result of hundreds of hours spent in the mountains. He didn't think. He acted on instincts honed to perfection. His body knew what to do. He pressed his back against one wall, braced his feet against the other, and slowly slid deeper into the stone belly. Ahead, another ledge appeared that had to be overcome. About 10 feet above the bottom of the canyon, a boulder was stuck in a narrow passage, a so-called chalk stone, a common occurrence in these parts. For the engineer inside Iran, it was a simple physical task. The boulder looked monolithic, embedded in the rock, held in place by friction and its own weight. It was part of the landscape, a reliable support. Aaron reached out with his right hand and confidently grabbed its edge. He shifted some of his weight onto it, preparing to move his foot and descend further. It was a movement he had made thousands of times. Mundane, routine, and that was precisely why it was fatal. The moment his fingers closed around the cold sandstone, he disrupted the fragile balance that had been maintained here for perhaps hundreds of years. The rock, which had seemed immovable, swayed imperceptibly. It lasted less than a second. The slight vibration that passed through his palm was replaced by a low, grinding sound. The boulder, weighing nearly 900 pounds, broke loose from its place. Aaron's world turned upside down. He didn't have time to scream or pull his hand away. Gravity pulled him down with the stone block. He felt the rough wall of the canyon scrape the skin off his shoulder and back. Dust and small stones rained down on his face. All he could see was the chaotic flash of orange walls and that same strip of sky above. And then there was a deafening, wet crunch. A sound he felt with his whole body. It was the sound of breaking bones. His right arm, caught between the boulder and the rock, was crushed. The impact was so strong that his body was thrown up and spun around. He fell to the bottom of the canyon, but his right hand remained up there, trapped in a stone vise. An unnatural silence ensued, broken only by the ringing in his ears and the slowly settling dust. For the first few seconds, he felt nothing. No pain. Nothing. His brain, overloaded with signals, simply shut down. He lay at the bottom of the canyon, staring at his arm, which was unnaturally twisted and pinned against the wall by a boulder. It was like a bad dream, a surreal painting. He blinked, expecting everything to disappear, but nothing changed. And then a wave of primal terror washed over him, followed by a rush of pure adrenaline. The pain hadn't come yet. It was replaced by animal rage. He jumped to his feet and screamed. It wasn't a cry for help, but the roar of a cornered beast. He began to tear his arm out of the trap. He pulled with all his might, bracing his feet against the wall, his muscles burning with tension. He growled, cursed, his face contorted with rage. Again and again he threw his whole body against the boulder, trying to move it even an inch. He pounded the rock with his left hand, kicked it with his feet, but the boulder was completely immovable, as if mocking his futile efforts. He struggled like this for almost an hour, until his lungs began to burn and his body was covered in sticky sweat. He was utterly exhausted, but still couldn't believe what had happened. The adrenaline began to recede, and with its departure came pain. At first, it was a dull, aching throb, but after a few minutes, it turned into a blinding white flash that pierced his entire body. Every heartbeat reverberated with a throbbing fire in his shattered forearm. He doubled over and vomited. For the first time, he truly realized his situation. The stone couldn't be moved. His arm was crushed. He was alone. The sun began to set. The narrow strip of sky visible from the canyon changed color from bright blue to crimson, then to dark purple. The temperature started to drop sharply. The cold penetrated to his bones. Aaron sat down on the cold rock, his body shaking. He looked at his trapped hand, which began to swell and darken before his eyes. The illusion of control, the illusion of invulnerability, the whole philosophy of the lone wolf that he professed, crumbled to dust. He was not the master of his universe. He was just a small, fragile creature caught in the trap of an ancient, indifferent rock. In the darkness and absolute silence that had fallen, he thought clearly for the first time. "I'm going to die here." The first dawn came without warmth. A cold gray strip of light slowly crept down the canyon wall, illuminating a scene of frozen despair. The night had been torture. Every minute stretched into an eternity filled with throbbing pain and the chattering of his own teeth. But with the first rays of sunlight, the panic that had tormented Aaron in the darkness receded. It was replaced by the cold, analytical mind of an engineer. Emotions were a useless luxury. He had a problem, and it had to be solved. He forced himself to move. First things first, inventory. Carefully with his left hand, he took off his backpack and laid its contents out on a flat rock. The picture was depressing. About a liter of water in a Camelback hydrator, 2 cold burritos in foil, a few candies, a cheap knockoff multi-tool he got as a gift when he bought a flashlight, a coil of climbing rope, a few carabiners and a harness, and a video camera. That was his entire arsenal against 900 pounds of rock and the silent desert. He set a strict ration: 1 sip of water every hour, 1 bite of burrito every 3. It was a game of survival, and time became his main enemy. Then he got to work. The idea of moving the boulder was absurd, so he chose a different strategy: to destroy the rock. He took out his multi-tool and opened the short, blunt blade. He began methodically, inch by inch, scratching and chipping away at the tiny pieces of sandstone around his trapped hand. It was exhausting, monotonous work. The sound of metal scraping against stone became the only sound in his world. Hour after hour, he picked at the rock until the fingers of his left hand went numb and the knife blade was dulled entirely. By the end of the day, he realized that his progress was measured in inches. At this rate, it would take years to free himself. But while Aaron was fighting for his life in a stone trap, hundreds of miles away in the civilized world, another drama, invisible to him, was unfolding. On Monday morning, at the Ute Mountaineer store in Aspen, his colleagues noticed his empty workstation. This was not like Iran. He could be reckless, but he was always punctual. His boss, concerned by the lack of a call, dialed his mother's number, Donna Ralston. One short phone call set off a chain reaction of quiet horror that slowly but inexorably began to gather momentum. Aaron himself was unaware of this. His reality was that it was his second day in the canyon. He discarded the useless tool. The destruction strategy had failed. The sandstone was too strong and his blade too dull. But if the rock couldn't be destroyed, perhaps it could be moved. His brain, trained for years at Intel to solve systems problems, instantly switched gears. He stopped seeing the boulder as an obstacle to be broken, and instead viewed it as a physical object with mass and a fulcrum. It was a problem of levers and force. Using rope, carabiners, and his harness, he began to construct a complex pulley system, a system of blocks that could theoretically multiply his effort and allow him to lift the boulder. It was a demonstration of his intelligence and training. With one hand, he secured the ropes and tied knots, creating a lever. When the system was ready, he gathered all his remaining strength and pulled. The rope stretched to its limit, his muscles burning with tension. For a moment, it seemed to him that the stone had given way, but it was only the elasticity of the rope. The boulder did not move an inch. This failure was worse than the first. It took away not only his strength, but also his hope. His body began to give up. Dehydration made his blood thicker, forcing his heart to work overtime. His crushed hand swelled beyond recognition and took on a deathly blue hue. A faint, nauseating smell began to emanate from it. By the fourth day, the line between reality and delirium began to blur. He had long since run out of water and was drinking his own warm, bitter urine. He no longer felt hunger, only constant nausea. At night, he was tormented by hallucinations. The shadows on the canyon walls turned into moving figures, and the wind carried fragments of non-existent conversations. He realized that his mind was betraying him, and then he took out his video camera. It was his last rational act. He pressed the record button and began to speak. He addressed his parents, his sister, and his friends. His voice was hoarse and quiet. He apologized for his stupidity, for not leaving a note. He recalled moments from his childhood, parties with friends, and the euphoria of mountain peaks. He cried, unashamed of the camera. It was his confession, his farewell. When the camera battery was almost dead, he took a multi-tool. He began to scratch his name, date of birth, and estimated date of death on the canyon wall. He was preparing his own grave. He had come to terms with it. He was ready to die. On the last night, the cold finally penetrated his body. He was no longer shivering. His body, having exhausted all its resources, began to shut down, sinking into an icy stupor. He accepted it. Here, in this stone crevice, was his end. And in that knowledge, there was a strange, peaceful silence. He closed his eyes, ready to dissolve into the darkness. But instead of darkness, light came. It was not a sharp ray of sunlight breaking through the canyon, but a soft, warm, light-filled stream that seemed to come from within himself. The feeling of the rock beneath his back disappeared. He was no longer in the canyon. He saw himself from the outside, standing in some kind of room, and noticed with detached curiosity that his right arm was missing below the elbow. It caused neither shock nor horror. It was simply a fact, as if it had always been that way. And then he saw him. A little boy of about 3, with light curly hair and piercing blue eyes, ran up to him. He instinctively picked up the child with his only left arm. The boy, trusting, snuggled up to him, looked him straight in the eye, and asked in a voice he had never heard before but recognized immediately, "Daddy, can we play now?" That look, that simple question, said it all. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't a dream. It was a promise. It was a future that had not yet come, but which already existed. It was his son. And at that moment, Aaron realized that it was not the will to live that was saving him, but something much more powerful, the will to love. When dawn broke on the 5th day, Aaron woke up a different man. The despair was gone. In its place was an icy, almost supernatural clarity. He knew he would survive. He had to live to meet this boy. His gaze fell on his dead, rotting hand. The smell of decay became unbearable. In a fit of rage and disgust, he stabbed it with the blade of his knife. There was a hissing sound as gases escaped from under the skin. The flesh was soft, like jelly. He tugged at his arm again, but this time he felt something new. The bones inside his forearm bent strangely, as if they were wet branches. And at that moment, his engineering brain and his latest desperate will to live came together. He understood. He couldn't move the stone, but he could break bones. He looked at his hand, then at the blunt blade of the multi-tool. His hand was no longer part of his body. It had become the last obstacle. The vision of his future son gave him a goal, but his meager arsenal dictated the method. His gaze fell on the multi-tool. That pathetic 2-inch blade, which barely scratched the sandstone, was utterly useless against the 2 strong bones of his forearm. He couldn't saw through them. That meant only one thing. Before amputating his arm, he had to break the bones. He wrapped a climbing rope around his forearm, just above the elbow, and tightened it with a carabiner until he felt the pulse in his arm fade. The blood flow was stopped. Then he braced his feet against the canyon wall, turned his body, using it as a lever, and leaned heavily on his trapped arm. There was a dull, wet crack that echoed off the walls. A flash of white pain made him cry out through clenched teeth. It was the radius bone. He took a breath, gathered his strength, and repeated the movement. Another disgusting crunch. His ulna was broken. Now his arm hung by soft tissue like a broken branch. He took out his multi-tool. The blunt 2-inch blade seemed a ridiculous, almost mocking tool for such a monstrous task. It was not a clean cut, but a rough, methodical grind that took an entire hour. He forced his mind to dissociate from his body. His hand was no longer a part of him, but merely an object that held him captive. Every inch came with superhuman effort. The muscles yielded slowly, the blade sticking in the tissue. The tendons, elastic as steel cables, required dozens of monotonous, exhausting movements to cut through. He clung to the image of the boy from his vision. That image was the only thing that kept him conscious, as each severed tendon sent flashes of white light behind his eyes, threatening to plunge him into darkness. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, the resistance disappeared. One last dull tear of fabric, and he was free. For a moment, he was overcome with euphoria. Still, almost immediately, weakness overwhelmed him, and he collapsed to the bottom of the canyon, nearly losing consciousness. His body, deprived of nearly 1.5 liters of blood and exhausted by 5 days of starvation, barely obeyed him. Aaron wrapped the stump of his arm in a plastic bag and made a bandage out of his camelback hydration pack. Ahead of him lay a life path that seemed impossible. The first test was a 65-foot sheer cliff, which he had to descend on a rope using only one hand. Every foot was a risk of falling into the abyss, his body swaying and bumping against the rocks. After climbing out of the narrow crevice, he wandered across the wide bottom of the canyon, staggering like a ghost. He walked nearly 6 miles, leaving small drops of blood on the sand behind him. The world around him seemed unreal, blurred by weakness and pain. By the morning of Thursday, May, the search headquarters in Emery County was filled with despondency. Almost 3 days had passed since the missing person report. A helicopter piloted by Terry Mercer had been methodically combing the maze of canyons for several hours. Still, from the air, the narrow crevices looked like thin, lifeless scars on the desert's body. It was almost impossible to spot a person in them. On board, Sergeant Mitch Veeder, who was leading the search, looked down gloomily. They had found a pickup truck, then a bicycle, but the trail ended there. With each passing hour, the chances of finding Aaron alive were rapidly dwindling, and the search operation was in danger of turning into a mission to find a body. And just at that moment, when hope was almost gone, a message came in over the radio from a ranger. Several tourists, the Dutch Meyer family, had stumbled upon the missing man. They were the first to see him, an emaciated figure wandering toward them with a wild look in his eyes and something dark wrapped around his arm. Their first instinct was fear. Monique Meyer instinctively covered her young son, thinking he was some kind of madman. But then they heard his voice, surprisingly calm and clear. "Hi, my name is Aaron. Are you looking for me? I just cut off my arm and I need help." When the helicopter landed, the rescuers were shocked by what they saw, but they were even more impressed by this man's resilience. In response to their questions, he simply and matter-of-factly described what he had done. As he was being led to the helicopter, he even asked to have his picture taken. Mitch Vetter's report, which later became legendary, was sent to headquarters via radio. "He looks normal. He's walking. He looks pretty strong." The road to recovery was long and painful. The physical pain from the surgeries and the phantom pains in his missing limb, which he described as hot needles, were only part of the ordeal. It was much more challenging to cope with the psychological trauma, nightmares, and flashbacks. But the man who returned from the canyon was no longer the same man who had entered it. The tragedy did not break him, it rebuilt him. His engineering mind, which had spent so long searching for a way out of the stone trap, was now focused on a new challenge: how to become a full-fledged climber again. The first prosthesis was a simple mechanical hook, but Aaron saw it not as a limitation, but as an opportunity. He began training, adapting his body and technique to the new realities, and then modified the prosthesis to create a special ice axe attachment. Just a few months after the amputation, he was back in the mountains. And in 2005, he accomplished what seemed unthinkable. He completed his 14ers project, becoming the first person to climb all of Colorado's highest peaks solo in winter. This final ascent was not just a sporting achievement. It was an act of affirmation of life, proof that his amputated arm had not amputated his spirit. The story of his rescue spread around the world, transforming him from a little-known climber into a global symbol of the will to live. He wrote a best-selling book and became one of the most sought-after motivational speakers. By telling his story to thousands of people, he found new meaning. He realized that the boulder that nearly killed him had become his most excellent teacher. It taught him that true strength lies not in absolute self-sufficiency, but in connection with other people. The arrogance of a lone wolf gave way to humility and gratitude. A few weeks after his rescue, a team of 13 rangers, armed with a winch and a hydraulic jack, returned to the scene of the tragedy. It took them several hours to move the boulder and extract the remains of his arm. This operation only emphasized how hopeless his situation had been. Later, Aaron cremated them. Exactly 6 months later, on his 28th birthday, he returned to Blue John Canyon. He stood in the very spot where he had been ready to die and scattered the ashes over the rocks. It was not an act of mourning, but an act of acceptance. He left his past where it belonged. Years later, this story found its proper ending. Aaron Ralston, a man saved not so much by his will to live as by his will to love, became a father. His son, Leo, was a boy with blonde hair and blue eyes. The vision that came to him in his delirium at the bottom of the canyon had become reality. The story of Aaron Ralston is not just a story about fighting a rock. It is a story about a man's struggle with his main enemy, his own arrogance, which led him into a trap long before the boulder fell. What really happened in the silence of the canyon? Was it a random, cruel tragedy, or an inevitable lesson for a man who considered himself completely invulnerable? What saved him at the decisive moment? The cold calculation of an engineer breaking bones according to a premeditated plan, or the mystical vision of his son that came to him on the brink of life and death? And perhaps the most critical question, is it really necessary for a person to find themselves in absolute solitude, on the very threshold of oblivion, to truly appreciate their connection with other people? Share your opinion in the comments. We always find them very interesting to read. Don't forget to like this story if you enjoyed it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new incredible stories. Take care, and see you in the next episodes.